So I want to pick up on some of the points that the previous speakers have made and basically say that today we have 7.2 billion food experts living on this planet. And that's the problem, because they don't agree on much of anything. And I will guarantee that only 0.1% of them are aware of any of the points that I will make in the talk today. So the question is, how should we think about food? Or rather, how do we create awareness? How do we build consensus around key problems and strategic focus, and then proof of concept to accelerate change? If we can't agree on the problem, we certainly won't agree on the solution. So this presentation is about what are the problems, what are some opportunities, what are people doing about it, and what can we all do as we move forward. I work for an NGO, WWF, and we have come to believe that if we don't get where and how we produce food right, we can turn out the light and go home. We won't have biodiversity, and we won't have ecosystem services that we need. Today, food production is the biggest threat to the planet, and going forward, it's only going to become worse. So let's start with some of the issues. This is the challenge. In the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. And we've got to do it in a way that doesn't threaten our planet. You don't have to take a lot of notes on this talk, because everybody who wants it will be given a copy of the talk in a PDF form. One of the things that I don't think we understand is the speed of change today. It took the UK 155 years to double the GDP of 9 million people. It took China 12 years to double the GDP of 1 billion people. It took India 17 years to double the GDP of 822 million people. What's interesting is once China had doubled its GDP per capita in 1995, it took 6 years for that to really hit the commodity markets in 2006. Excuse me, it took 11 years for that to hit the commodity markets in 2006. India finished doubling its GDP in 2006. If its impact is the same as China's, it's going to be 2020 before it hits commodity markets. This is what we have to look forward to. Nobody's thinking about these connections. And yet, this is what has happened to food prices and social unrest, including the Arab Spring, but not just. Each of these yellow dots represents a food riot where somebody died. And it correlates very well with food prices. So we know we're going to increase population, but it's actually, the rate of increase is declining. It's only going to be 25 to 30% by 2050. Consumption is in fact going to double, primarily because incomes are going to increase by 190%. So let's look at this in another way. Today, if we have 7 billion people consuming 1 unit's worth of production each, we have 7 billion units of consumption on the planet. By 2050, we're going to have at least billion, 9.5, most people are saying, consuming twice as much. That's 18 billion units of consumption. It's not just doubling the number of people we have today, it's doubling the consumption of each. And to make those 18 billion units of consumption fit on the planet with no added impact to what we have today, we have to shrink by 40% to 50% how we produce each of those units of consumption to get it to fit on the planet we have today. That's the challenge going forward. So by 2050, 9 billion people, we're going to have to produce about twice as much food with everything continuing as is, business as usual, no particular changes. Let's just look at where we are with food production today. According to most scientists, we're using about 40% of the planet, the terrestrial planet, to produce food. We have about 5% that's in desert. about 18% that's in mountains, lakes, rivers, and streams, about 2% in cities, about 12% in park and protections and national parks, etc. About 23% more is left to produce food. We're using 40% today. We cannot double the amount of land we have to produce food by 2050. So we can't simply extensify production. That's called agricultural sprawl. And the impact on the planet is much worse than urban sprawl. So the issue going forward isn't what to think about food production. There is no single answer, no silver bullet. It's how to think about food production. We've got to figure out how to make production more efficient. And intensification is going to be key. You've heard more from less as a mantra in the first two speakers. That's certainly the case. But I think we need to challenge some basic assumptions. So should consumers actually have a choice about sustainable products? Or should all the products on the shelf be sustainable? And if it's the latter, how do we make that the norm? How do we make every product that a company manufactures more sustainable than the ones today? It also means making choices about what we eat, about smarter consumption. Today, 60% of all the land we use, not including cereal grains for feed, just the pasture land, 60% of all the land we use on the planet produces 1.3% of the calories in the form of beef. Now that's maybe 3% of the nutrients, and it's land that we couldn't use to produce crops. But still, on a more efficient planet, we're going to have to produce 3 to 5% of the calories and nutrients on 30% of the land. How do we intensify beef production without simply putting them in feedlots, which require more and more feed? We're going to make choices between different forms of animal protein for more sustainable consumption, and we're already doing that. 2 years ago, global aquaculture production surpassed global beef production for the first time ever on the planet. And that's a trend that's continuing. That is a smarter trend if we get aquaculture right. But aquaculture has impacts too, and we have to think about that. Food security, as was mentioned just a minute ago, is national security. And global trade is going to be key. How we manage trade on a planet where comparative advantage is real is very important for the overall sustainability. And yet today, trade barriers for food, particularly regional trade barriers, are greater than any other single sector. We can't focus on everything. We've got to be strategic. So we at WWF looked at what are the key commodities that are expanding most rapidly in terms of production in the areas that are the most important from a biodiversity and ecosystem service point of view. And we came up with these 15 commodities. And we started working on them, and we're now developing standards for better production and helping companies, both suppliers and on the supply and demand side, move there. But here's also how the world has changed. In the past, such strategies would be driven by Europe or the US or both in combination. I'm running out of battery. This is the role of China in relation to those 15 commodities. And this is the role of India in relation to those 15 commodities. The world is changing, and our strategies have to shift as well to reflect that. So we got to freeze the footprint of food. And the question is, how are we going to do that? Well, we think the answer is not a single strategy. We think we've got to focus on productivity and efficiency on the one side, on intensification sustainably, but we've also got to focus on reducing waste and post-harvest loss and making consumption better. Not eliminating consumption, not trying to reduce consumption, but on better consumption. Let's just look at waste. Today we waste 1 of 3 calories produced on the planet. Put another way, 50% of the food that we consume today, that amount is wasted. That is half of the new food we would have to produce by 2050. But let's look at this another way. If food production is 30 to 35% of all greenhouse gases, including land use and land use change and livestock, etc., then food waste represents 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. 10%. Just the wasted part of food, not fed to cows, not fed to cars, not fed to people. If we use 70% of all the water on the planet for people in the production of food, then food waste represents 23% of all the water that we use on the planet, just the food waste. There are twofers and threefers and fourfers here where if we solve a problem, we can solve 4 other problems at the same time. And incidentally, food waste causes consumers to pay more for food and producers to get less for it. So food waste is a huge issue. Genetics, as we say where I'm from in the US, dance with the one that brought you. We wouldn't be in hotels like this without genetics and plant breeding. We would be hunters and gatherers. So it's not a question of if genetics, it's a question of which genetics and which strategies, and every country is going to be different about that. But we cannot take genetics off the table going forward. These are the 14 crops that produce 75 to 80% of the calories we consume every day. But the genetic improvements in these crops are not sufficient to double productivity by 2050. And in fact, in the last 4 years, they've not only flattened, they've started to turn down. My question is, instead of focusing on the crops that are grown in temperate areas and the crops that are currently being produced to produce most of the nutrients that we consume, why not focus on the crops that are the most important for food security in the places where population and income are going to grow the most? Africa, the subcontinent of Asia. These are the orphan crops of the world, the ones that haven't yet benefited from modern plant breeding. Why not double, triple, or quadruple the productivity of these crops? What do I mean by that? Corn yields 5% of the calories per hectare in Iowa as bananas do in Costa Rica. Bananas yield 1/3 of the calories per hectare in Costa Rica as sugarcane in Brazil. So why spend so much time focusing on nutrients and productivity in corn when we could just focus on nutrients in either of these 2 other crops? Because we already have the productivity. It's about how we think about the problem. What is the problem? We need more nutrients and more calories. What crops produce it? How do we think about that? Better practices, we know, are 100 times better than the worst ones. Most of the programs of NGOs that focus on food focus on certification, on verification programs that certify some producers are better. That's the right-hand side of this equation. That's the top 10, 20%, and that can pull 50% of markets. The problem is the better producers aren't the ones that have the impacts that we care about. It's the worst producers. It's the ones on the other end. The bottom 25% of producers of any commodity on the planet produce 50% of the impacts and only 10% of the product. So if we want to double food productivity and reduce impacts, we don't focus on the best, we focus on the worst. And this is a debate that we have got to engage government in, because demand from the north is not going to pull all the way down to the bottom of these supply chains. It's going to pull the top half, maybe the top 2/3. How do we move the bottom? By proving the business case for better practices for job security, food security, employment, exports, etc., and show it to government and get them to step in. But government today is absent without leave. We need government engaged on these issues, and they're just not. The goal has got to be to shift this performance curve. And then there's climate change, or euphemistically, as it's now called, extreme weather. We're going to get some of that tomorrow. It's going to affect production. In the short term, climate-smart agriculture is efficient. It's more productive. It's using inputs better. In the medium to long term, it's about changing crops. Almost every place where we have mapped the future viability of growing the same crop in the same place, it's a 90 to 95% reduced area where it's actually even suitable to be grown. So we're going to have to grow crops in different places. The only country that I know who is looking at this is Mexico, who knows they won't be able to produce coffee going forward, even by 2025. So they're looking at cocoa as a substitute. What other countries are beginning to think that way? That is climate adaptation, if you will. Put another way, if the worst producers are small farmers often, which is the case, and they're not producing their current crops particularly well, what are they going to do with the new crop? That's a real risk going forward, but it's also a way to leapfrog into a new technology, provide new packages, to provide new services, new extension services, to actually let them do a step change. But it won't happen by itself, and it won't happen if we don't start focusing on it. And it needs to happen soon, because most of these impacts start kicking in now by 2020 and certainly by 2025. We've also got to figure out how to move more sustainable, certified product from niche to norm. Organic, we can argue all day about whether it's sustainable or not, has captured less than 1% of the global food market in 40 years. That's simply not fast enough. We have got to move much more quickly. I want to talk a little bit about what 4 different types of institutions have done to move towards sustainability. Unilever is the first company that has made an all-in commitment as a company that 100% of all the bio-based raw materials they source will be produced sustainably by 2020. That's 3,300 raw materials that they buy. First company to do it. Now we've got a number of other companies following. We've also had a platform, the Consumer Goods Forum, retailers and brands, 400 globally, where 57 of them have agreed to take deforestation out of their supply chains. They're focusing on 4 commodities in 2 countries, because that's 50% of global deforestation. And their interest in this represents $40 to $50 billion of purchases, which can be used as incentives to shift loans, to shift banks, to shift trading companies, to begin to move in a different way. We also have a sector, Salmon Aquaculture, that has gone all in around certified product. CEOs of 15 major producing companies that represent 70% of production globally agreed that they would be certified against credible standards by 2020 last August. What they agreed to do, which is different than anybody else, is share all their data about practices, investments, return on investments, what works, what fails. This is all pre-competitive from their point of view. Because what the best salmon producers came to realize is their reputation is tainted by what the worst producers are doing. So they've got to raise the whole industry up if they want license to expand their operations, or if they want to get into markets. That is a trend, that pre-competitive trend, which is more important now than ever. And just last October, we had the first country make a commitment that 100% of food exports would be certified as sustainable by 2016. Ireland. They're now working with about 180,000 dairy producers and 140,000 beef producers. And this has only happened because government, the private sector, and producers have all agreed to work together, and again, to share their information about how to improve more quickly. Now, why are companies and countries beginning to do this? And I think it's all about risk. On the one hand, it's about risk of supply chain raw material availability in a resource-constrained planet with more consumption, but it's also about reputation and reputational risk. Let me just show some data from a survey of S&P 500 companies. In 1975, 83% of the valuation of the S&P 500 was based on tangible assets, so factories, fleets, concrete types of production systems, etc. By 2009, 81% was intangible. It was brand value, it was reputation, it was about whether you were associated with killing orangutans on the front page of a Washington Post article or the Sunday Times. We have just done some research that shows that today between 5 and 50% of all globally traded commodities of any category are not produced legally in the country of question. This is a huge reputational risk. This is the risk that is the next issue on the horizon, and this is one that companies are worried about. So as we used to say in Missouri, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We know we have to get to 2050. We're going to have to produce more food. How much depends on how wisely we produce and consume the current food. Nobody can do everything about this, but everybody can do something. Thank you.